Yeah.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. There's no fire alarm drill anticipated today, but for your awareness, a service of the alarm system is being undertaken, so there may be brief bursts of it. Please do not be alarmed. Somebody got it at least. Thank you, Ben. And also, please make sure all phones are either muted or switched off. To start the meeting then, good morning everyone and welcome to this Strategic Planning Committee meeting on the 22nd of November 2024. I'm your chair, Councillor Todd Olive. To my right is Vice Chair, Councillor Mike Howe. Supporting officers present are Ed Freeman, Assistant Director, Planning Strategy and Development Management, Damien Hunter, Planning Solicitor, and Sarah James, Democratic Services Officer. Can I remind everyone present that this meeting is recorded for publication on the Council's website, so please can members and officers making contribution to the meeting use a microphone or your comments will not be recorded. We will now start the meeting by doing a roll call of committee members and declarations of interest.
Sorry, beg your pardon. Thank you. We'll start with yourself. Councillor Olive, please.
I am here and I have nothing to declare.
Thank you. Councillor Howe?
I am here also and nothing to declare.
Thank you. Councillor Brian Bailey?
Present, nothing to declare.
Thank you. Councillor Jess Bailey?
Present. I would like to just reference that I'm a Devon County Councillor for item 12. And I'm aware that Devon County have put in a bid for in relation to Tipton St John, but as we're not actually going to be discussing the applications, the grant applications, I don't propose declaring a formal interest. I've taken advice, but I'm just putting it out there that so I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Colin Brown, please.
Present, thank you. Nothing to declare.
Thank you. And Councillor Bethany Collins is not with us this morning. Councillor Fernley. Councillor Fernley?
Sorry, yes, present. And I mean, I've had lots of emails, people trying to change our minds about stuff, and I'm sure everybody has, so I'm just lobbying emails.
Thank you. Councillor Hayward.
Thank you. Can I declare an effects NRI in respect of agenda item 6 and agenda item 10, which relates to my employment as the Clerk of Axminster Town Council? Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Ingham.
Present, no declarations.
Thank you. Councillor Young.
Present, except for quite a few lobbying emails, no declarations, and I'm afraid I have to leave at 12:30. I've got another engagement in the Midlands.
Thank you. Councillor Ledger is not here. And Councillor Parr, please.
Thank you. Present and declaration of interest. Item 6, settlement boundaries, effects and prejudicial NRI due to my partner's financial interest, and it's as set out in my register of interests. Thank you.
Thank you. And I can confirm that we're quiet, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Parr, are you not logged into your mic? I saw it came up with... Oh, you changed places. Okay. Could somebody help her out with that one? Thank you. We'll get that sorted for you, Helen. Agenda item 1 then. Apologies. I have Councillors Davey, Blakey and Levine from committee and Jackson from outside committee. Do we have any others? No? Okay, thank you. Agenda item 2, declarations of interest, we have already done, which brings us then to agenda item 3, public speaking, and we have a number of members of the public and indeed councillors registered to speak this morning, and we start with Councillor Andrew Minter from Lympstone Parish Council.
Councillors, good morning. First of all, I'd like to say a thank you to Councillors Ingham and Young for their continued unwavering guidance and support to Lympstone Parish Council and to their continued attendance at our Parish Council meetings. It's immensely appreciated as always. Lympstone Parish Council is disappointed with the lack of any real consultation preceding this proposed redrawing of the villages and Exmouth's settlement boundaries, particularly as a large swathe of the increase in Exmouth is in Lympstone Parish and swallows up a sizable part of the green wedge between the two settlements on Lympstone's southern boundary. Lympstone Parish Council and residents were heartened to see the exclusion of the remainder of GHED 72 from the proposed new settlement boundary for the village, as this gives some comfort that EDDC has listened to the parish's arguments over overdevelopment in the parish and is what, after all, a Tier 3 settlement, moderate growth by the SPC's own admission. However, the parish is very disappointed by the unnatural additional bulge to Exmouth's BUAB settlement at Lympstone 07 Cortlands Cross, which is on the Lympstone side of Cortlands Lane and is within Lympstone Parish, over which Lympstone Parish Council has nominal jurisdiction. This site in Lympstone is in Lympstone and is much closer to the Lympstone village than it is to the centre of Exmouth and to Exmouth services. It leaves the merest scrap of precious green wedge between the two, Lympstone and Exmouth, and it's merely an exigency on the part of EDDC to meet Exmouth's government-imposed housing targets, shoehorning part of the village, Lympstone, into Exmouth settlement. You've allowed coalescence to start through the back door here, I'm afraid. The allocation of this site at the SPC meeting on the 29th of October was done on the basis of 100 houses on the site, which was accepted at the time. The proposed planner, PCL Planning, stated that talks have started about the provision of a sports ground or football pitch on the site as well. Whilst the parish opinion on the site in development terms is generally negative, the inclusion of a sports ground is likely to gain some support and traction for the development if it has to happen. There are no other flat, suitable, spacious areas in the village where this could be done. As such, we would like to see EDDC amend the settlement plan for this corner of Lympstone, whereby a proportion of this site is excluded from the settlement area, so that the developer of the site could not renege on any promise concerning sports grounds to build houses on all the space instead. It will be a real quid pro quo to Lympstone for the degradation of the green wedge in EDDC's allocating this site for development. Woodbury and Lympstone Parish Councils have presented a landscape proposal to EDDC for undeveloped land around the two settlements, which does include the green wedge between Exmouth and Lympstone. We would expect that any sports ground provision space on the Cortlands Cross development would be included within this protected landscape proposal. Exmouth is a Tier 1 settlement with nowhere...
Councillor Minter, could I ask you to wrap up, please?
Sure. With nowhere left to build, bordered by internationally important ex-estuary, the Channel, national landscape and a conservation area village, which is Lympstone. Lympstone does not want to become part of Exmouth, nor does Exmouth want to become part of Lympstone, nor does Lympstone want to become a Tier 2 settlement. The site allocation process has been ghastly for everybody. The next local plan, a Whitehall allocated housing target, we expect EDDC will consider the damage this has done to Lympstone Parish now. 200 plus allocated new houses, increasing the housing stock in the parish by more than 20%. This is not moderate development.
Thank you, Councillor Minter. Councillor Roy Collins. If you're signed in at your microphone, Roy, you're welcome to just stay there if you prefer. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. I'm very disappointed with this committee. You failed to protect agricultural land in East Devon. I've stated the case for keeping agricultural land, the world situation. Two times I've spoken about this. Today, the world situation has got much worse. We've got Russia sending ballistic missiles. They could well land in this country. You don't seem to understand how dangerous it is in the world. Also, the amount of rainforest, every 2 minutes, a size of a football pitch is disappearing in the rainforest. All that carbon's going to be emitted from those forests. And there you are, taking all this agricultural land that we need to produce food. You know there's been a lot of protests with farmers with inheritance tax. If they go on strike and do not send food to warehouses and distribution centres, this country will be starving. There's only 2 days' worth of food in these supermarkets. It'll be all gone in 2 days. That's all it would take. Farmers are very angry. We need our land. And you're just taking it away. It's all wrong. Also, this committee is just forcing this through. There's not been proper public consultation. I got a plan in Honey 18, no public consultation. Public don't know about it. I've been tried to be silenced by Damon Hunter today. He's trying to silence me.
Sorry,
I'm going to
Chair,
take this up. I'm going to have legal opinion. I've got legal opinion. Legal opinion, and not what they tell me is wrong. I've been to the Council for Protection of Rural England, and hopefully they will be supporting me. Also, I'd like to know why East Devon Council does not send a representative to the Council of Protection of Rural England's meetings. We're the only district council in Devon not to have a representative. We always used to send them. I've checked back through minutes of various meetings. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Collins. Could you turn the microphone off, please? Thank you. Mr Hunter?
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to clarify for members. I've been asked to give some advice to Councillor Collins. He's actually asked to see a copy of our barrister's opinion that we got when we were asked to consider whether we could include some new sites in the Regulation 19 consultation when they hadn't been consulted on at the Regulation 18 stage. Now, the barrister said, obviously, it's best to include them at the Regulation 18 stage, which we've done with all of the ones that we asked for. But these sites were put forward late in the day. We didn't ask for them, but they were put forward. We also have a duty to consider sites that are put forward to us. And I basically asked him, is it going to be a problem if we put these forward now to Regulation 19 stage, having not consulted at Regulation 18 stage? He said it wasn't a problem. The Regulation 19 stage includes a public inquiry where the public will be able to put forward their comments and concerns. The inspector will be able to take them on board. So obviously, in an ideal world, you'd like to be able to do the Regulation 18 stage and the Regulation 19 stage. Potentially, the problem with anything of this is that it may be a problem for us, is that somebody may bring something up at the Regulation 19 stage that we hadn't envisaged beforehand. But we're of the view that I think there's one site that is worthwhile including, and the members of the public will be able to have their say at that stage. I've tried to explain that to Councillor Collins this morning. I've given him a copy of a judgment which the barrister's provided to us, which explains that that's perfectly legal and sound. I have no more to say on it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just to add to that, I mean, I think the site that's at issue for Councillor Collins is Honey 18, which I think is the site that Damon referred to, which wasn't consulted on at Reg 18 stage. As things stand, members have given delegated authority to myself and the Chair to include that site if the National Highways agree to the access arrangements to that site, which members will recall was off a classified road. So the position as set out in the reports and as things stand is that if that site is included in the Reg 19 plan, it will go out to consultation and be brought back to this committee to consider the consultation responses on that site before it goes to full council to then be considered for submission to the examination process. So members will have an opportunity to consider any comments received during that consultation process themselves, as well as through the examination process as set out by Mr. Hunter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Moving on to our next public speaker. I'm going through the public speakers now. Sorry, Ben. Councillor Jane Blackmore from Fennerton. Good morning.
At item 7 on your agenda today, you are being asked to approve the local plan strategy for development throughout the settlement hierarchy. You will all have received copies of correspondence between the Chairman of Fennerton Parish Council and the Chairman of this committee about the proposed allocations in Fennerton. You will be very aware that Fennerton is one of the Tier 4 service villages. It is in the lowest tier because it has very few jobs, few services and limited infrastructure. Although these figures are not in your report, the Parish Council has calculated that with 102 dwellings, Fennerton is being allocated by far the highest number of dwellings of all the service villages. Furthermore, it has been allocated considerably more dwellings than 3 of the 5 local centres in Tier 3 above. These settlements clearly have much better access to jobs, services and infrastructure. Your spatial strategy for Tier 4 settlement is one of the modest growth to meet local need. Clearly something has gone wrong in the allocation process when a small village with well-known flooding and infrastructure problems is being expected to take more development than towns and large villages, much better placed to accommodate such growth in a more sustainable manner. The Parish Council has agreed that a large disused nursery site in the village will provide a good opportunity to allow modest growth to meet local need over the planned period. However, at the meeting on the 1st of November, you narrowly located a site for a further 60 dwellings in a vote that split your committee. There is no evidence there is local need for 102 new homes. Your report at item 7 today shows that you have headroom in the housing figures of 55 dwellings. The Parish Council asks that you delete site Fenny 08 Beechwood from the plan. It is a site previously refused consent by the District Council. It is a site that has already been rejected at a planning inquiry by a planning inspector who in conclusion said that large-scale development in Fennerton would harm community cohesion. If the District Council is serious in its ambition to promote sustainable development, it cannot in good faith allocate more houses in small villages where residents will be massively dependent on travel by private car to get to work and to meet a range of daily needs. The Parish Council was prevented from speaking on the employment site Ottery 20 when it was considered at this committee despite it being very obvious at Fennerton site. I just want to put on record the Parish Council's firm opposition to employment development on Green Lane, which is totally inadequate for commercial traffic. Residents of the village are aghast at the prospect of an 11-acre semi-industrial site on a narrow lane with no footway and 2 hump railway bridges. Again, the Parish Council would ask you to reconsider this allocation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Blackmore. Next, I believe we have a statement to be read out from Councillor Charlotte Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Charlotte Fitzgerald writes, "Dear members, I realise time is running out to finish this onerous process, so I thank you for considering my points today. My comments relate to agenda item 8 regarding the viability study and suggested affordable housing policy amendments. Rural areas in our made local plan attract a requirement of 50% affordable housing. If this committee endorses the policy recommendations being discussed today, this requirement will be reduced to 30%. The viability study underpinning these proposals has grouped together the entire rural area of the district and some towns into a single bracket, which is marked as V3 and shown in green on the map on page 299 of the agenda pack. By making this sweeping standardisation, the proposed policy does not account for the significant variance in affordability among rural settlements within the district. Exton and Lympstone spring to mind, as well as 2 villages within my ward, East Budleigh and Otterton, which attract some of the highest house prices in East Devon. The latter 2 villages are working villages with excellent undercapacity schools and huge demand for affordable housing from local residents, many of whom currently live in sought-after expensive private rental properties. In the same vein, I am concerned by the proposed policy written at the top of the graph on page 301, which reads that sites of 0 to 9 dwellings will attract a 0% affordable housing requirement. For villages such as those mentioned above, being situated in a national landscape, so not attracting much development, even small developments are not insignificant and should not be exempt from affordable housing requirements. Indeed, the very same graph shows that viability for affordable housing is at its joint highest in developments of only 8 dwellings. I therefore urge this committee to reconsider first the minimum threshold housing development size for affordable housing, and second, the blanket classification of rural areas for the same. End of Councillor Fitzgerald's statement. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Freeman will come back on those points when we get to the relevant report later on in the agenda. Next up then, we have Mr. Lestin John on behalf of Clinton Devon Estates.
Thanks, Chair. Committee. I'm just referring to your agenda item 7, site allocations. And it's really further to your proposed allocation for part of Budley 01 for 50 houses, and which reflects Budley Salterton's size and role as you discussed and proposed at your last committee meeting. Officers indicated that any allocation of the within Budley 01 should focus on the 3 fields within the southeastern part of the site, as these were likely to be least visible. However, this was subject to some confirmation of the likely landscape effects and the provision of an access. In the very short time since the last committee, further work has been done by Clinton Devon Estates to give comfort, hopefully, on these points. I circulated this to you and to officers yesterday, and hopefully you will have had a chance, albeit a brief one, to review. And just to summarise, that these are the images. There's a master plan here and a zone of visual influence plan here as well. And I just wanted to take the opportunity briefly to highlight the key points arising from that work. Robust analysis has been done by LHC Design, who are a local design practice of some repute, including an objective review of likely visibility of the scheme. That's the zone of visibility plan. A constraints analysis and a highways assessment has also been undertaken by Bellamy Transport Planning. 50 dwellings can be delivered on the 3 fields identified by officers, with an access at an acceptable position from Bedlands Lane. The access arrangements won't generate any significant landscape harm. Bedlands Lane can accommodate the traffic for 50 units without loss of the boundary hedge, the length of the hedge needing to be removed to provide the required visibility displays can be replaced. The length of access road over the field to the north into the development would be relatively short, would not be prominent because of the topography, and could be screened, as shown in the plan, by new boundary hedges and tree planting. The layout shows that 50 dwellings can be accommodated at a density appropriate to the character of Budley Salterton, with ample space for landscaping, biodiversity and drainage, all of which will help development blend into the character of the area. The layout uses lower topography and separation to ensure the outlook of existing residents would be protected. And as with all of its schemes, any development by the estate of this land will have design and environmental quality at its forefront. The visibility analysis plan confirms that the land is discreetly located, as we suspected. Beyond other parts of Budley 01, views from the surrounding area are very limited, especially from public rights-of-way, roads, etc. Where views do occur, these are generally either glimpses or from longer distances when the site would be seen within the context of the adjoining landscape. I hope that's a useful summary. I hope it aids you with your deliberations and confirmation of the position for the allocation of the land. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. John. And for members' benefits, the outcome of the delegated authority that you gave to Mr. Freeman in consultation with me will come to committee on the 11th of December. We're not discussing site allocation decisions today. I would say that Mr. Freeman and I didn't particularly like what was initially put in front of us, but there is room for further discussion still between now and the 11th of December. We then come to our last public speaker for this morning, Ms. Valerie Ansfield from Sawston Barton. Statement to be read out. Thank you.
Thank you. Our objections relate to the item concerning defining settlement boundaries. Residents of Sawston have been participating in consideration of sites to be allocated for potential housing development. As part of this, we have contended that Sawston is a hamlet separate from Ottery St Mary, and it appears that our arguments have been totally ignored. In fact, the boundary proposed at present splits the properties that historically comprise the hamlet. Reference to the making of footways to the town ignore the fact that the sites involved have this and many other associated problems that have led to them not being allocated, yet this report reads as though they are considered viable. Other areas in East Devon in this report have been excluded for flooding impact. This is also the case here, yet it is not mentioned in the report that has led to the proposed boundary outline. Therefore, decisions are being made in reverse order. Elected representatives are being incompletely briefed, and complaints about the process which have already been lodged by us do not feature. We entirely object to the manner in which this is conducted. End of statement.
Okay, thank you. We come then to agenda item 4, matters of urgency. There are none. And agenda item 5, to agree any items to be dealt with after the public have been excluded. Again, there are none there. Which brings us to agenda item 6, the East Devon Local Plan defining settlement boundaries. Mr. Freeman.
Thank you, Chair. So this report refers to obviously defining settlement boundaries around the Tier 1 to 4 settlements in the plan. So it addresses both the boundaries, which are shown in the appendix to the report, and also the related policies, which members will recall were deferred from your previous meeting so that they could be considered alongside the boundaries themselves. In terms of the drawing of the boundaries, they've been drawn in accordance with a methodology that was agreed by the committee in April 22. Noted by the committee, apparently, in April 2022. And was used to define the boundaries, which then went into the draft plan, which was consulted on at the end of 22 and into early 23. We've obviously now been through all of the consultation responses and considered those, and done a second stage of assessment of the site boundaries, which is set out in Appendix 1 to the report. So you can see the Stage 1 assessment, which was consulted on, and then any amendments that have arisen through the Stage 2 assessment following the consultation exercise, and obviously now the allocation of sites where the boundaries have needed to be drawn round those agreed allocations. So what's before you is a covering report, and then in Appendix 1 you'll see the boundaries and assessment work that's been taken place in each of the settlements. I don't propose to go through them in turn at this point, although happy to pick up on any issues with particular boundaries as we go through. And the policies SPO5 and SPO6 are as drafted and referred to in the previous agenda. So the recommendations are twofold. One is to endorse policies SPO5 and SPO6 as set out in paragraphs 1.2 and 1.3 in the report for inclusion in the Regulation 19 draft of the plan. These are the policies that basically set out that development within the settlement boundaries is acceptable in principle, and beyond is open countryside where other than where expressly permitted in the plan development would not be acceptable. And then recommendation 2 seeks the committee's endorsement of the boundaries defined in the settlement boundaries evidence paper, which is appended to the report for their inclusion in the Regulation 19 plan. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. So conscious that folks, I'm expecting, will have comments on individual boundaries. What I'm going to do is pick out the ones where we've received specific representations and where there's an issue with conflict of interest for Councillor Parr. We'll do those boundaries first, then we will go through the rest. Any that don't have any comments we will take en bloc at the end of that, and we'll finish off by doing the policy. I promise it will make sense as we go through it. So first of all, for any comments on anything in the chapter from outside committee, so anything at all in the chapter, Councillor Faithful.
Thank you. That's what my initial question was. Where do we get a word in? Reference sites at Salston, Barton area, and the boundary. I don't know how do we determine what's got pedestrian access and what hasn't, because the parts, the line of the boundary seems to go right through the houses they have been put outside because lack of pedestrian access have the same pedestrian access as the sites that are put inside the boundary. I don't know. is it Ottery? I can't remember off the top of my head. I don't have the numbers in, but yeah, the southwest part of Ottery boundary. And a further question related to Ottery 20 at Fennerton. The comments by Damien Hunter reference late entry. I assume the same applies to Ottery 20, that it'll be on consultation in Regulation 19. Thank you, Chair.
We'll check that point on Ottery 20 for you, Peter, and we'll come to Ottery as one of the ones that we bring out at the beginning as we go through. Are there any further comments from outside committee on anything in the chapter? Councillor Collins.
I'd like to speak on Honiton. Do I do it now or when you come to Honiton? Now. Earlier, Honiton 19 was mentioned. The existing boundary runs up the back of Kings Road down to the railway line. You're proposing to include Honey 18 in the new boundary. I would like it taken out, please.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Collins. Ottery 20, Mr. Freeman, any news yet? No, I'm still looking. Okay. In which case, then, we're going to go into that point I made a minute ago. We're going to do the Broad Hembury settlement boundary first, because we have a statement from the parish council that they asked to be read out next to the item. So we'll do that one first, and then we will do Colliton for Councillor Parr.
Thank you, Chair. So statement from Broad Hembury Parish Council. Settlement boundaries or built-up area boundaries, BUAB, define boundaries around settlements within which different planning policies apply. Within the boundary, development is more likely to be acceptable than outside the boundary. In the case of Broad Hembury Village, the land outside the proposed boundary is classed as open countryside, where there is a presumption against building except in certain circumstances. Until 2016, when the BUAB was removed, it consisted of two sections split by a gap at the floodplain of the River Tail. The two portions on the southern edge were within the boundary of the AONB, now the National Landscape. The proposed settlement boundary has joined the previously separate sections by including the floodplain within the boundary and by enlarging the area in accordance with criteria B1 and B2. Recent flooding of the River Tail at this point makes any development unrealistic. Whilst criterion B2 clearly refers to Broad Hembury Memorial Hall, which has existed since 1923, we can see no further rationale for B2 and must therefore assume that enlargement is based on criterion B1. We are not aware of specific applications which would qualify for B1 enlargement. General criterion A1, boundaries should reflect existing scale and core build, cannot be used to justify the east and west ends of the BUAB because neither end reflects the scale and core build of the village. Similarly, criterion A2, boundaries should follow clearly defined physical features, etc., does not justify the extension of the boundary to the south, shown as yellow plan page 21 evidence document, because it arbitrarily cuts across an open field. We therefore submit that the application of the criteria to justify the enlargement of the BUAB from its earlier area is inconsistent in methodology. We reject the proposal to redraw the BUAB and the conclusions of the site selection report. We do not believe that the two issues should be considered independently because the BUAB has been in part redrawn specifically to include the preferred site, which is itself weak in terms of methodology and legally open to lengthy and persistent challenge. We are open to discussion with the relevant planning officer to develop a plan which is more consistent with what the local community seeks, whilst recognising EDDC's imperative to develop housing. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Freeman, is there anything specific you wanted to clarify in there? If the answer is no, that's okay.
Just on the Broad Henbury point, I have dug out the boundary that they're referring to from the local plan before, the current one, which did have sort of two separate boundaries for Broad Henbury separated by the flood zone. I think to explain the difference, obviously we're using a different criteria this time, a different methodology, which has been purposely designed and members agreed should be drawn sort of more loosely around more loose-knit development that was previously outside the settlement boundary. So hence the boundary for Broad Henbury has been drawn a bit bigger than it was previously. Certainly the area in the middle where the flood zone is obviously couldn't be built on anyway because it's flood zone, so I don't see that it really makes any difference whether it's within the boundary or not, but logically it makes sense to have a single boundary where we can. So that's the thinking in terms of Broad Henbury. I have tracked through for to Councillor Faithfull's comments. Ottery 20 was shown on the plan at the Reg 18 consultation stage. In terms of the sites between Salston and Ottery, I'd take point about...
Should we talk about them when we get to Ottery?
Sorry, I thought you wanted me to respond at this point.
No, just Broad Henbury.
Okay, I'll come back to that.
Sorry, Ed, I should have been clearer. Just a question for me then, Ed. If could you confirm for us why the proposed sites for allocation that are going into the Regulation 19 version are shown within the settlement boundary?
Well, I think there's a logical principle of including all of the allocations within the settlement boundaries as they're sites that the committee has agreed to be allocated and developed as part of the plan. So they form part of the settlement moving forward. If you leave them outside, you've then got a direct contradiction between the allocation and our policies on development within and outside of settlement boundaries, because you're then on one plan showing it in the open countryside and then in another saying it's allocated for development. So I think logically and consistently, it makes sense to draw the boundaries to include all of the allocations.
Okay, members, any comments on the Broad Henbury boundary? Councillor Young?
Yeah, is it possible to exclude the, I presume it's flood zone 3? Could we exclude the flood zone 3 area? But bear in mind that might be changing sometime next year because the Environment Agency are doing consultations on withdrawing those.
You can do. I mean, I'm not precious about it. I think I'm not sure what implications that would have for other settlements which have flood zones running through them if we started excluding land because it's flood zone. I suppose my point would be, since it can't be built on anyway because it's flood zone, I'm not sure what taking it out of the settlement boundary achieves. I think it's cleaner to have a single boundary for each settlement that is one continuous boundary. And if that takes in an area of flood zone, I don't see any harm in that being within the settlement boundary because other policies would limit development on that part of the settlement because of the flood zone issues. But I'm open to members' views if we want to exclude flood zone areas. But I think in some settlements that might lead to rather odd boundaries being drawn. Thinking of other settlements that we've got, particularly if you think how much of Exmouth, for example, is in flood zone 3. Much of the town centre is alongside the estuary. So you could have quite a strange boundary that then excludes the town centre of our biggest town.
Can I just come back? A very good point made, I think. So the built-up area boundary basically will say you can develop there, but then they look at another map with flood zone 3, it would say you can't build a house there. So you need to look at both maps if you're considering to build there, basically. So that resolves that issue.
I think the point there is that the development plan must always be read as a whole and not just individual policies. I've read Mr. Freeman's mind. Good start to the day. Okay, any other comments on the Broad I was about to say Broadhenbury boundary. No, okay, members happy to note that one then. I'll propose it from the chair. All in favour, please. That's carried. Okay, thank you. Do you want the numbers, Mr. Hunter, or are you happy that it was carried? Mr. Hunter is happy. Okay, good. The next one to come to then was the, I said we were going to come to Colliton next. So, Councillor Parr, did you want to speak now before? Okay, then we'll just give you a moment to leave the room, and then we'll do Colliton. Okay, do any members of committee have any comments on the Colliton boundary? No, okay. Councillor Bailey.
There's a little bit of nibbling on the east, isn't there, at the top? And we've got a bit of nibbling going on in West Hill where it's not massive changes, but I don't see why the boundaries have been redrawn from the villages plan, which we did masses of work on. Actually, I think it was before my time. You did massive work on. And yet here, if you look at the kind of like dinosaur head at the top, there's like bits that have changed slightly, and I'm not sure that unless there's a really good reason, just little nibbly bits should be just changed.
Yeah, Mr. Freeman.
Yeah, I'm not sure about nibbling. I think they've actually got bigger because it's the black boundary is the one we're asking members to agree. The kind of orangey one was the villages plan. So it's actually got slightly looser. Yes.
Nibbling of the countryside.
Yes. And that's the result of the methodology. And I think there was a separate report that members discussed about how sort of loosely to draw the boundaries to enable more sort of organic growth of settlements through infill development and development on their edges. And so the methodology has led to the boundaries deliberately being drawn slightly looser, they're a bit baggier, as it were, to enable that sort of natural organic growth of settlements into those areas that are perhaps on their periphery, slightly lower density, and perhaps leave opportunities for infill development as part of the natural organic growth of those settlements. So that's part of the methodology, and that's why that's the case.
Councillor Ingham.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to know, Colliton example there, what is the point of the two exception sites being outside the built-up area boundary, other than to confuse people? Why would you do?
I can only assume, and it's not something I'd picked up on, but it's a good point. I can assume that because they're exception sites, obviously they've come forward as 2/3 affordable housing. And there must be some concern that by putting them in the boundaries that might come in at risk. I'm not sure where they are in terms of their development and build out. I don't know if Mr. Dickens knows more, but I can only assume because that's the only thing that would distinguish them from the rest of the settlement.
No, both sites are built. I mean, I think there's an issue here that because they were granted as exceptions to normal policy, putting them outside reflects that status and just clarifies that they were historically built under a specific clause that allowed for particular affordable housing schemes to come forward. And it's just really, more than anything else, it's carrying forward that historic status and recognition of why they were granted permission in the first place.
Moving forward with a new plan that's emerging. So I'd recommend that they're included so that our vision of Colleton is up to date and coherent. You can't unbuild those houses, and people may say, oh, well, you can't pull down a house there and ask to put in a replacement one because it's outside the built-up area. A whole plethora of confusion is included in that. Okay.
It's a good point, Councillor Ingham. Mr. Freeman's just whispered to me that he's not precious about it. Mr. Dickens, do you have any particular strong feelings? No? Okay.
Can I ask, Chair, that if there's other examples that at the next meeting we're told about them, because on review, Mr. Freeman and Mr. Dickens may say, oh, well, that also applies to other settlements. Can they check that and maybe come back to us? Thank you, Chair.
Yes, if I may on that, is part of the reason I made the point in response to Councillor Young's comment, is that if we were including that land at Broad Henbury that we were speaking about a minute ago, excluded it from the built-up area boundary because it was flood zone, then consistently would need to apply that across all of the settlement boundaries. So I agree entirely the same applies if members are minded to include the exception sites at Colleton, then we would need to include any other exception sites elsewhere within the settlement boundaries so that there's a consistent approach across them all. So that's something I would suggest if members are so minded that that needs to be a resolution on that principle that applies elsewhere, not just Colleton.
Presumably that's on the assumption that those exception sites meet the other criteria that are set out. I'm thinking there's one in Wimple which is a kind of setback from the edge of the settlement.
Yes, that's a good point. Assuming they comply in all other respects of the criteria. Yeah.
Okay. Suddenly we have a sea of hands. Councillor Hayward has been waiting patiently, and then I have Councillors Howe and Young.
Thank you, Chair. It was simply to agree with Councillor Ingham on this particular point. A lot of what we've done in the last month, 2 months, I would argue is exceptional because of circumstances foisted upon us. So actually, that might actually lend itself to confusion. And whilst we all know they're exception, they're written on a map, Mr. Dickens and other officers and indeed members, we know they were exception sites. They're no longer exceptional. It's just part and parcel of what we're having to do. So actually to draw that black line around that southernmost part and then the bit within the, I think Councillor Berry referred it as a dinosaur head. I'm not sure. It looks more like I don't know, robot head, that bit. So those two housing allocations, which are shown on the Colleton BUA map as exception sites, I just think should just be included, and we'll take that policy forward as we look at others. Thank you.
So I'm going to move from the chair at this point that we establish the principle of including exception sites, subject to them meeting the rest of the criteria. Are there any comments on that specifically? Councillor Howe, then Councillor Young.
That was the very point I wanted to make sure we understood. Yes, exception sites, but it can only be exception sites when they're built out to be included within the built-out area boundary. Because otherwise, if we allocate and grant permission to an exception site, but it isn't built, I can see developers going, I don't have to do that anymore. It's now within a built-up area boundary, hey presto. So we need to make sure we have that caveat finished, completed first.
I'll amend my proposal to say completed exception sites to cover that point. Councillor Young.
Councillor Howe took my point there exactly. We did have a problem with a site on a previous plan that was included into the built-up area boundary, and then the developer then changed their mind and didn't develop the affordable housing. So I would say exception sites, once they're built, yes, but prior to them being built, they should be excluded.
Councillor Ingham.
Sorry, Chair, just to point out, I'm clear in my mind that when we had the previous emerging local plan, we did include those sites that we'd identified. I can think of one in our ward where that happened. So for consistency, we need to be careful, because otherwise they said, well, why did you chop and change that, from one plan to the other when the wording's exactly the same? Yeah, so, well, can be all very similar.
Okay, so you have that proposal. Any further comments? No? Okay, all those in favour, please. Jeff, are you voting? That's unanimous. Thank you. And then any further comments on the Colleton boundaries specifically? So we can bring Helen back in. No? Okay, in which case I'll move that one from the chair. All those in favour, please. That's unanimous. Thank you, Ben. Okay, the next one to pull out then is Ottery, I believe. And Mr. Freeman, did you want to come to those comments?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I just wanted to respond to Councillor Faithfull's comments, I think, about the land between Ottery and Salston. You've got the allocations, Ottery 10 and the one next to it, GHUD 27. And I think the point was that we were excluding areas around there because of no safe pedestrian access, and that applied equally to the allocations. I think the difference is through the discussion on the allocations, we felt, the committee felt that acceptable pedestrian cycle access into the town could be obtained through linking into the developments to the north. So there's a logic, therefore, to including the allocations on the basis that they can deliver that safe access. It may be that some of those adjoining areas could be included in a later plan once those arrangements are in place. But obviously to do that before those routes are in place would seem premature. So that's the logic of including that. And as I said before, obviously there's the logic of including all of the allocations within the settlement boundaries, so that there's consistency across the plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. Committee, comments on the Ottery boundaries. Councillor Bailey. Jess Bailey.
Thank you. I'm looking at this and I think that it hasn't got all the allocations on it. I'd be very happy if they weren't being allocated, but I think on the east, there are sites that aren't shown, so we can't really assess the boundaries without seeing all the allocations, because what I really don't want there to be is bigger boundaries than allocations. And I've also got something to say about Tipton, which I don't know whether you want to. Okay.
We're just going to check that for you, Jess. In the meantime, are there any other comments from inside committee on the Ottery boundaries? Councillor Ingham. Your microphone, sorry, Ben.
Can you explain to me why there's the green dotted line on the map that's not annotated? Oh, sorry, not explained through a key or legend.
I think the green dotted lines are probably public footpaths from the base OS map, aren't they? The green dotted lines.
Are they? Oh, thank you.
I think that's
Yes,
what
I think they're on the OS base that the map's been drawn on. Yeah.
And yeah, here you go, Ed. That's the Ottery ones. So you're correct, Jess. There is one that isn't shown. It's Ottery 21, which is just in that kind of blank gap between the thick black line next to Go Away Farm and the edge of the settlement. So the line is in the correct place, but the allocation isn't shown. And then Ottery 15 is on there, but I can't see any other discrepancies.
Yeah, so the boundary is in the correct place. It's just that Ottery 21 as an allocation isn't annotated on there.
So that's just a drafting error, is it?
Yes, apologies for that.
Okay. Any further comments on the Ottery boundary then? Okay, in which case I will move that one from the chair. All those in favour, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That was 7. Those against? And those abstaining? That's 2, and Colin decided he didn't want to vote. Oh, I missed you, did I? Oh, okay. If you say so, Colin. All right, that's the Ottery one then. Are there any other specific boundaries that members wanted to pick out to comment on? Councillor Bailey, Brian Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. I hope this is the appropriate time. There's a lot of concern in Old Bystock Village in Exmouth, which at the moment is outside of the built-up area boundary. And looking at the plans, the proposal is to move the built-up area boundary so that the old village would be within the built-up area boundary. Now, this village is 400 years old. It's one of 2 surviving ancient villages in the country that I'm aware. And it's in the curtilage of a listed building, which is Bystock House. So could you assure me, please, that this boundary will be kept as is, so that Bystock Village is not within the built-up area boundary?
Okay, so we'll do the Exmouth built-up area
Thank you, Chair.
boundary now then. Thank you, Councillor Bailey. I'm not an expert on Old Bystock Village, but I think this map shows it as inside the boundary. It's that little bit there, isn't it, Mike? Yeah. So the recommendation from officers is that it is inside the boundary. I don't know if anyone can comment on that.
There is some coverage, Chair, in the report of this issue. I'm just scanning it to refresh my memory. Yeah, it's page 40 in the appendix, if that helps. And it says that there was concern about its inclusion and that it not being well related to built environment. And then we're saying, although the area is on the periphery of Exmouth, it's considered to be physically and functionally related to it and therefore complies with criteria B2. This link will be further strengthened by proposed allocations. Criteria B3 relates to allocations in a made neighbourhood plan and so is not applicable in this case, which I think was the other reason being given. So it has been included as things stand. I mean, again, I think the point to make is that the plan needs to be read as a whole. So the fact that it's historic and setting of a historic listed building would obviously put significant constraints on any development potential and needs to be protected as a heritage asset, whether it's within the settlement boundary or not. So I understand the concerns the community have, and you've expressed, Councillor Bailey, but I think those issues still apply and those constraints still apply, whether it's within the built-up area boundary or not. The question is whether or not it's appropriate to include it based on the criteria that we set for drawing these boundaries, and our assessment as things stand is that it should be. Happy to hear contrary views if members feel we've got that wrong.
Okay, thank you for that explanation, Mr. Freeman. Councillor Bailey, did you want to come back?
I believe, if memory serves, that in our neighbourhood plan for Exmouth, it is not within the built-up area boundary as the maps were put through on, I think, 2015, some time ago. So this is where the confusion is lying for the residents, because there appears to be the line that you're proposing and the line that's already there. So they want some clarification, please. Thank you, Ed.
Well, so the boundary within the neighbourhood plan would still be there. We're drawing a boundary in terms of the local plan. I appreciate that's going to get confusing, and obviously the neighbourhood plan would there show a different boundary until it's reviewed, and that issue would need to be looked at again. But I don't think, we don't have to follow the neighbourhood plan. We obviously need to have regard to it in our decisions, but ultimately the local plan takes precedent over the neighbourhood plan. So I think it does come back to the criteria we're using, whether or not it's appropriate to include that area within the boundary. I think what we're saying is that it complies with criteria B2 under the criteria that we've used.
There is concern about protecting the heritage of the area. And that's why they're concerned. Thank you.
All I would add, Chair, is that the heritage of the area is protected whether it's within the settlement boundary or not. There are policies elsewhere in the plan that seek to protect listed buildings, registered parks and gardens and heritage assets. So that protection exists whether it's within the settlement boundary or not. We obviously have many listed buildings and heritage assets outside of settlement boundaries that still benefit from the protection of those policies in the local plan, and indeed national guidance from Heritage England and within the National Planning Policy Framework.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Freeman. So those protections do definitively still apply, Brian. Okay, councillors Young and then Ingham.
Yeah, regarding Limston 7, which is included in the Exmouth, can we cover the issue with the playing field that was covered by Limston Parish Council at the start of the meeting? And also in Exmouth 20, there's an area at the top that is butting onto the SSSI. There's a 400-metre non-development area set by Natural England. Could that be excluded from the built-up area boundary? Because there's concern that by looking at this map, it suggests that there's going to be housing right up to the SSSI, which we wouldn't be able to do anyway.
I think that's almost the same point as on the flood risk, isn't it? Where the built-up area boundary defines the extent of the built-up area, but that there are other policies that you've got to read it at the same time as.
The line has been drawn down from the development area because it's going to be, it's not going to be built on, but it's part of the development. So now I was trying to get the same strategy in both areas, and there's a lot of concern of Exmo 20 and how it will butt up against the national landscape and the SSSI.
Okay, so Mr. Dickens has given me a look that says he wishes to speak.
Yes, just to say, for consistency of approach, as has been highlighted, there would be a clear logic in both Limpo 7 and Exmouth 20 to make the changes you've suggested to the boundary, just to clarify where built development clearly would be allowed under policy and where it wouldn't. So, I mean, I wouldn't see any objection or concern about those changes given the consistency issue as applies elsewhere.
Through you, Chair. So happy in terms of Exmo 20. In terms of Limpo 7, I think it raises a wider issue in terms of where developments are proposing, such as a football pitch. In the case of Limpo 7, we've got a football pitch north of Seaton on Ceto 5, I think. There's also other developments where there's mitigation proposed. You know, whether or not that's going to be habitat mitigation or whether the Chair's got Wimple up. There's WIM 08, which has an orchard to the north of it, as to whether or not that's included or excluded. So I think this is another case where there's a principle here, as with the exception sites, where it would be interesting to hear members' views as to whether or not areas of land that are not to be built on necessarily, but are providing mitigation for the development or wider mitigation and infrastructure for the community should be included within the boundary or not. I'm not precious either way, because I think the allocations policies that we'll come on to in the next item make it clear which parts of the site are to be developed and which parts are for mitigation. And as we've said, the plan needs to be read as a whole. So if you put them within the boundary, it's not necessarily saying that those areas would be built on. If elsewhere, in terms of the details of the allocation, we're clear that that's to be used for mitigation, but we do need to be consistent one way or another.
So I'm going to suggest then that we make a resolution that areas that are for mitigation should be excluded. I think that if fundamentally, if an area is not going to be built on because it's going to be mitigation, then it oughtn't be in the built-up area boundary, is my instinct,
So,
unless there are other criteria that mean it should be.
So stemming from that would therefore be, so you would still allocate them as part of the allocation, but only include the parts of an allocation that's to be built on within the built-up area boundary. Is that what we're saying?
Is that a point that we need to pick up when we come to chapter 6 on the next agenda item, or do you want to deal with it now?
I think it crosses both items. So before members make a resolution on the settlement boundaries, we need to resolve that issue, I would suggest. Otherwise, your resolution on the settlement boundaries could be inconsistent with a decision you then subsequently make.
Okay. Councillor Howe.
For a change, I'm actually going to take my strategic planning hat on and put my planning hat on. And I'm trying to understand the argument. Correction. I understand the argument, actually sympathise totally with the argument, but I'm sitting here thinking a planning application comes before the planning committee, which has mitigation outside of a built-up area boundary. Planning committee will probably look at that fairly dimly, as they usually do. So we've got to be really careful about what we're doing and how we portray it to both residents and planners and everyone else. It's not as easy as we think.
Do the allocation maps need to be changed so that there's an area defined for the housing allocation and then an area defined for the mitigation? Is that the simplest?
I see no reason why we couldn't show them in a different colour or annotation of some description. But I'm not sure that changes anything in terms of the settlement boundaries and where you're drawing those.
I kind of want to ask Mr. Freeman what his advice is for what we do before we go into further discussion, because I sense we could go round and round on this. Yeah. Mr. Freeman, what's your advice?
Well, I'm looking at what we've proposed. I mean, certainly in terms of Limpo 7, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Dickens, included the land for the football pitch within the settlement boundaries things stand. And then on the chair screen, I see WIM 08, which has excluded the orchard area. So I think that, and thinking through the report, I think the logic we followed is that if the development is providing a piece of infrastructure that's necessary to make the development acceptable, we've included it as part of the allocation and within the settlement boundary. Where it's just an adjoining piece of land that we want to maintain, such as the orchard, we've excluded it as things stand. And I think there's a logic to that approach, because the creation of a football pitch is a change of use of land. It is development. So logically, it is part of the allocation and part of the development. So I think logically it should be included within the settlement boundary. Simply retaining an orchard is not development. Wouldn't need any kind of permission. So there's no need for it to be within the settlement boundary.
I think my constructive challenge there would be, why is it a built-up area boundary if we're including, that's what the policy is, isn't it? Built-up area boundaries.
Deliberately called them settlement boundaries rather than built-up area boundaries in this plan.
Okay. Councillor Young.
Yeah, I think the definition is built-up area boundary. We can't build in that built-up area boundary, so why should it be included?
Mr. Freeman has just quite rightly corrected me that we've changed it from built-up area boundary in the last plan to settlement boundary in this plan. So that was my error. So it is settlement boundary now. Councillor Ingham.
Firstly, on that point, because it's the last one I can remember, the danger is, I would suggest, or the risk is, if you omit it, then at a next emerging local plan, applicant may say, oh, well, we didn't build on that, still own it. And you say, no, that wasn't what we agreed last time. So that's all, as Mr. Freeman explained, that's all part and parcel of the mitigation now for what we're agreeing. So you put that in black and white, don't you, and make that clear. I think Mr. Freeman's right on that one. Can I continue, Chair? There's one point. You see Exmo 20, which goes right up to Salterton Road, except for a little chunk, a rectangular chunk, where there's, I think it's 3 properties there. one that was recently pulled down and replaced, so, you know, it's fairly active. Why would you omit those? I would say include those in the settlement boundary. Yes, opposite where it says playing field, okay?
Yeah,
I'd say it makes
immediately off
sense to
Salisbury
include
Road.
that. Then I have to again thank Councillor Matt Hall for his work and suggestions to this committee. I think he was very observant. Well, you know, it's his job. That's why he was able to do so. I think it's such a shame that our officers didn't consider when that was identified, and it had been on the radar for 20 years, okay? But when we recently identified that as an option, that they didn't go back to check with the landowners adjacent to that, to the kind of the southeast, whether that could be included. I'm absolutely sure that in future emerging local plans, that will come forward, because he was quite right. He called it a golden triangle, didn't he, of opportunity or something like that. And I think he was exactly right. That's why, and it'd be no surprise to you, Chair, I can't agree to this, because I think it was an absolute travesty, including Limpo 7, as you heard from the Parish Council. I can't support that. But the point being, if you're going to expand Exmouth, you have to make sure it's, one, sustainable in its own right as much as possible, because it's so big, and such a shame that we're now going to see the Dinan Way link onto the A376, where 40 years ago we were trying to take traffic off it. Now here we are, 2024, we're trying to put more onto it, which you know, I'm sure we'll see very soon. It's an awful mistake. Thank you, Chair.
Chair, in terms of Exmo 20, I thought Councillor Young had made the point about excluding the parts of Exmo 20 that were within 400 metres of the Pebble Heath. So actually, perhaps members need to discuss that suggestion first, because that would pull the boundary back from that area, which makes that the issue Councillor Ingham's raised about the square a bit mute, because we'd be pulling in from that boundary anyway. If members are not minded to do that, then it would be relevant, I would suggest, to consider the point about whether or not you square that off.
Okay, so just to be clear then, Mr. Freeman, your advice is that where mitigating infrastructure is proposed, areas are included in the settlement boundary, but where that is not the case, they are excluded from the settlement boundary, and we could reflect those different uses in the policy allocations that we'll be talking about for Chapter 6?
Yes, that's right. So if we take Limpo 7 as an example, the football pitch that's proposed would be within the settlement boundary, and if you look at the text in Appendix 2A, I think it is, which has the wording of text of that policy, it refers to the delivery of a football pitch on the westernmost part of the site. So it's then consistent. But I think elsewhere, where it's just, you know, retaining an orchard, as in the Wimpole case, I don't really see the need to include that within the settlement boundary.
Okay, so are members clear on what Mr. Freeman's advice is there, before I take questions and challenges to that advice, which I can see bubbling? So I saw Councillor Hayward first, and then I have Councillor Ingham.
Thank you, Chair. I think this demonstrates the challenge that this committee always faces in trying to deliver consistency and clarity for the planning committee and in strategic terms. But it also demonstrates how none of us can enter a debate with a predetermined view, because my own view on this has just changed 3 times in the last 10 minutes listening to the debate, which is the whole purpose of debate, in that you hear new things. And I've now sort of formed the view that actually by including the new settlement boundaries, it's easier to have the settlement boundary and then later on in this discussion and in the next agenda item, actually exclude parts of that by another resolution. Whereas if you actually remove it now, you're almost making it impossible to do something else later on. So if you include it now, that's your settlement boundary, but then another decision will remove part of it by the very thing that Mr. Freeman has just provided clarity on and from his advice. We then get to the issue of what constitutes mitigation, because there's other maps in here where we've excluded areas from the settlement boundary because we're saying we're not going to build on that, but you might be providing some mitigation. But is that development mitigation, or is it infrastructure mitigation, or open space mitigation? So I do empathise with your role, Chair, and Mr. Freeman's in trying to formulate something that provides consistency in settlements that each are profoundly different to one another, but that's our challenge today. So thank you. I just wanted to make that point that I think we're all heading in the right direction. We all want the same thing. It's just the semantics of how we get there.
I think that was very well put, Councillor Hayward. So for the moment then, committee, do we want to make a resolution, or do we just roll on the basis that Mr. Freeman has described they've done so far? Councillor Ingham, then Councillor Young.
Thank you, Chair. I think we should split it and do the two things. One is following on the logic of Councillor Hayward. So we put that little one to bed, you know, across the board, across East Devon. I would say we considered, didn't we, in Budley Salterton, there was the one with 50 houses and a large mitigation on that and the benefits of having that. And I think when we do that, we have to prescribe that exactly. And there's another example where it would work. Whereas if you exclude it, yet again, someone may come back and say, oh, we want to build another 50 houses there, you know, in 10 years' time. Say, no, that wasn't what we intended. So we have to make that secure. I'm sure Mr. Freeman can do that. So therefore, the logic is, what Councillor Hayward said is that, you know, that we understand all that, so let's do it. And then we can come to Exmouth separately. That's what I'd suggest.
Councillor Hayward, you didn't mute your phone. So I Councillor Young.
Yeah, I go along with the logic, except for the SSSI, which I think we have to exclude. It's the highest category of land designation to be protected, and we're saying that it's in the development boundary, and that doesn't make sense to me. But I do understand now having snippets in descriptions of sites where, yes, there's going to be a football pitch, yes, there's going to be an orchard, but with the boundary of the SSSI, I think is sacrosanct.
So, through you, Chair, it's an interesting one, because I think this would be the only instance where that issue arises for start. So there's no issue of consistency here, thankfully. But so. So, what was I going to say?
There's no issue of consistency.
Yes. So, it then comes down to it is part of the XMO 20 area, but obviously they won't be able to build houses on it. But that would be secure through other policies in the plan. So we come back to the reading the plan as a whole issue. So whether it's within the settlement boundary or not, the position in terms of the 400 metres and ability to build on that part of the site won't change. But then if you come back to the logic about infrastructure and mitigation being within the settlement boundary as opposed to just land that's going to be left, we don't know at this stage until they master plan that area what might be delivered within that zone that's within 400 metres. They could deliver public open space, sports pitches and things within those areas, which would be part of the supporting infrastructure and may constitute a change of use or need planning permission in itself, but might still be fine in terms of the 400 metres. So therefore, logically, you'd leave it within the settlement boundary to be consistent with that approach. So I think my advice I'm now contradicting Mr. Dickens, apologies, but I think my advice would be, from the logic as the debate's gone on, the logic would be to leave it within the settlement boundary and rely on the policies elsewhere in the plan that would prevent development within 400 metres, development for housing within 400 metres of the pole beds.
That certainly makes sense to me. Does it make sense to Councillor Ingham?
Yes, it does. I just want to check, for example, with triple SIs, or if you've got a green wedge in coastal preservation areas, say, well, we've moved the line around the actual, what was a built-up area boundary, but the mitigation area will still be in there and is protected by them. So you say, so we can understand that's why the line's there, because that was the mitigation for that settlement, but the other part that isn't to be developed remains in the previous land allocation, coastal preservation, because it's not built on. Yeah, does it? That follows on that you protect each one with the current policy, unless you're changing it to enable housing. I think that's right, isn't it?
I think Councillor Ingham here, to clear up Mr. Freeman's confusion, is saying that, for example, if we take Limpo 7, where I think that example works a little better, if part of that site goes to a football pitch, that part of the site could remain within the green wedge, even if it were still. So those protections would remain in place as well, even if it was still part of the allocation and the settlement boundary.
Yes, that's certainly an option. I can't remember off the top of my head. I don't know if Mr. Dickens can, whether we've included that field that's the football pitch within the green wedge or not, but I don't see any reason why it can't remain within the green wedge if that's what members want.
Yeah, so the land in Exmo 20 would remain, yes, yeah. Yeah, so we're back to the reading the plan as a whole point, Jeff, that you raised with the flood risk issue in Broad Hembury. Do any other members agree with Jeff? I'm not that the area should be excluded from the settlement boundary. I'm not. You can make a proposal if you like, Jeff, but on that informal straw poll, I'm not sure you'll get very far. So I'll give you the opportunity now if you want to. Okay.
Can I propose then the opposite of that? Because as long as we have the concurrent explanations of land designation or usage, then those allocations are protected where we want to protect them and enabled where we want them to. I think that's right.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And on the basis that that's the approach that's been taken in defining these already, I'm not sure it needs a proposal, does it, Mr. Freeman?
No, Chair. I think as things stand, you're agreeing with the proposed boundary as recommended for Exmouth.
Okay, Councillor Young.
I'd just like to make the point that if that's the case, then we need to review the Sidford one because that's excluded out of the development boundary because it wasn't going to be built on, but it's included in the developer's area, and also the Wimple one where it's designated as an orchard. So now you either have one or the other, but you can't have mix and match, unfortunately.
Yeah, so we can pick that point up when we get to them. I think Mr. Freeman's point was that there are different types of mitigation, and where you're physically doing something and changing the use of land, then it should be included, but where you're not, it shouldn't. I think, have I understood that correct, Mr. Freeman?
Well summed up.
Ed is nodding.
Yep.
So we will pick that up when we get to them specifically, but I think we're probably okay. Are there any other comments on the Exmouth one specifically? I think we've reached the point where there aren't going to be any changes to this, I think. Councillor Brian Bailey, very quickly, because we've now talked about this for some time.
I hope this is the appropriate time, Chair. If it's not, you'll soon tell me, I'm sure.
I certainly will.
The site that is proposed to have 700 houses on it, which is St John's, in Exmouth, as it stands at the moment, the entrance to the site.
It's
would
not the
appear-
correct time.
Will today be
So
the correct time at all?
so we will be talking about the individual site allocation policy requirements in the next chapter. So the next agenda item, we will look at things like
Thank you
that.
very much, Chair.
Is it a comment about the boundary here?
Yes, because you said there'd be no changes after our discussion.
Oh, sorry, the little square. Yes,
Yeah,
thank you for reminding me. The little square at the top, Ed, is that going in or not?
It's 3 houses. Is it?
3 houses.
And gardens.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one Councillor Ingham mentioned.
Well, from my understanding of the criteria, it's adjoining built development to the boundary. So logically, I would have thought we would include it, yes. I'm not sure why we haven't.
Mr. Dickens, can you shed
No.
any light on this? Matt says no.
I suggest we just include it then, if members are happy with that.
Okay, so I'll move the boundary as it is, with the exception that we include that small square on the northeastern edge for consistency with the criteria. And I'll move that from the chair. All those in favour, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those against? 2. And those abstaining? 1. Okay, thank you. That is carried. Any other ones that members wanted to talk specifically about? Councillor Hayward.
Thank you, Chair. Just really, you'll be surprised, it's not about Axminster, actually. It's Budley Salterton. Obviously, the map on page 23, there's a reference to the site. This is to be revised, updated when Budley 1 allocation boundary agreed. Because obviously the settlement boundary here excludes that site. But of course, it was allocated later on. So just some clarity on what exactly or where that boundary will be, if I may.
Through you, Chair, that's ongoing discussions. So you heard Yestin John earlier in the public speaking session talking about where discussions have got to with this site. They've made, his clients and him have made a proposal that effectively comes across the top northeast 3 fields, I think it is, with an access off the lane and a road sort of looping round. I don't know if Matt's got a plan that he can show but on the screens, but into the northeast part of the site. As the chair said, we have some concerns which we're discussing with them. So I think it depends where those discussions get to by the time we get to the December 11th meeting as to where that boundary would show. I had understood when members determined to allocate part of that site that we were essentially talking about the most northeastern corner of that land, whereas the proposal is edging further west than I thought was significantly further west than I had understood was the intention. So we need to see where those discussions get to, and then we can make a formal proposal as to how we take that forward at the December 11th meeting. But those discussions are still ongoing, having only resolved, I think, to include that site on the 1st of this month. So we've only had 21 days to have those discussions with them. So that's ongoing, which is why that's caveated at this stage. So I can't give you a definitive answer as to where that will be, but that's where we are with that.
Give them an inch and they take a mile, was, I think, your words, Mr. Freeman. Okay, so we're on the Budley one then. So any further comments on the Budley one? No, okay, so we'll resolve to agree that one subject to the outcome of discussions around Budley 01. All those, I'll move that from the chair. All those in favour, please. That's unanimous. Okay, any other ones members wish to discuss? Councillor Jess Bailey, is it Tipton?
Yes, I'd like to discuss Tipton, please, and West Hill. So if we start with Tipton, which is on page 81 or 80 of my document.
81, yeah.
So we've previously agreed as a committee that 04 should be a school, and if it's not going to be a school, and 5 self-builds or nothing. But a bit like the discussions around the interplay between different chapters in our plan we've just had, I don't believe Ottery, I believe Ottery 04, by being shown in this way, is effectively undermining our decision that it should be a school and nothing else, because it's effectively being shown as inside the settlement boundary. And therefore, if a proposal came forward for housing, I think there would be real difficulty. So I would have thought, I certainly don't agree with Otter Close, etc., being included in the settlement boundary. And I think that Ottery 04, the boundary should be drawn around it. If and when a school is built, then and in a later local plan, then that's fine. That can be drawn around it. But I think we're undermining our own decision by showing it as within the settlement boundary. And it's a bit different from the discussions we've had before, because it's not part of a bigger scheme or a mitigation. It's an entity within itself. So I think it's to protect that site. And also, I need to talk to you about that site in the next chapter as well, because I'm concerned it's shown in that chapter as being yellow housing. And also I'm concerned about some of the wording. So I think we need to be really, really careful that we don't inadvertently put it forward for housing by showing it as an allocation within a settlement boundary. Thank you.
So yeah, through Chair, I think this is a difficult one on a number of levels. One is difficulty of a boundary around Tipton at all, really, because if the village loses the school, then arguably it wouldn't meet the criteria to be a Tier 4 settlement and shouldn't have a settlement boundary at all. So there's that. There's then the issue that Councillor Bailey quite rightly points out in terms of the allocation if it's within the settlement boundary. I mean, the wording of the policy, I should say, in terms of the next item does make it clear that should a new school not be built in Tipton St John village, the village would not meet the thresholds for Tier 4 settlement and new houses will not be permitted at this site. But by putting a settlement boundary around it, we are saying development within it would be acceptable in principle. The difficulty is we can only do this on the basis of what we currently know. Currently, there is a primary school there, and it may be that a primary school is rebuilt on a more suitable site, such as Ottery 04.
I mean, I can't see any disadvantage, sorry Ed, of just take it. I mean, I don't think it should have a built-up area boundary at all. I mean, that would be my, settlement boundary. That would be my first point. I actually agree with you, Ed. But I can't see what the disadvantage is to our local plan. If there has to be one, then why do we not draw it south of Ottery 04? Because we've accepted there's not going to be housing there. There's only ever going to be a school there. So it's not like we can use that for our numbers or anything. It would make sense, wouldn't it?
Just to be clear, I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't draw a settlement boundary around Tipton St John. I'm saying I think all we can do is draw boundaries based on the current position on the ground. Currently, there is a primary school there. Currently, it is a Tier 4 settlement based on the work that we've done and has been agreed by the committee, and so it should have a settlement boundary. But it raises the problem of what happens in the future, which is essentially what's been raised in terms of Ottery 04. I mean, I think the only way to address the issue is to do as you suggest and draw the boundary so it skirts around the southern boundary of Ottery 04. It's inconsistent with the criteria we've used elsewhere. So I can see we're going to need a little asterisk that says other than at Tipton St John where we've done this. But if members feel that that's the best way to go given the circumstances in that location with that site, then I think there is a justification for doing that.
I think this is a unique circumstance. We don't have any other instance where a school allocation would connect an additional bit of the settlement that otherwise wouldn't be in the boundary. So I'm going to move from the chair that this boundary is redrawn to exclude Ottery 04 and Otter Close to the north, so that the settlement boundary runs around the boundary of Ottery 04. So I'll move that from the chair and leave Mr. Freeman and Mr. Dickens to deal with the consequences if that resolution is passed. Any other comments on that before we go to a vote? Councillor Ingham.
Well, Mr. Freeman did mention the word consistency, didn't he? Which I think is really important. And when you have a settlement boundary, it does have to make sense. And we've questioned other ones that we've seen this morning and said why and this and that. This, to me, what we see before us is logical under the current circumstance. And if we meet a different circumstance, you know, for change in policy, change especially with education and delivery of that, then we can change accordingly. But to pretend we don't like the current status, that is wrong.
I don't. If we were talking about the current status, I mean, I don't think you would include 04 and Otter Close, because I don't. To me, the boundary of Tipton St John would run where I've just described in that proposal at the moment, because there's a very clear break in the settlement there that runs through Ottery 04. I'll be making the same point about Wimple in a little bit. I think the current circumstance on the ground is that the boundary is south of 04. Ms. Freeman, Councillor Howe.
It's the criteria of including the allocations that brings in Otter Close to the north, fundamentally. I think the challenge is, coming back to Councillor Ingham's point, is that we can only change a boundary or withdraw a boundary through a review of the local plan. So, but there is a danger that Tipton St John loses its school in the next couple of years, at which point you could have a number of years of this plan in place with a boundary that is including that site, which could then come forward for housing, as Councillor Bailey says. I mean, we're already running the risk that we have a boundary around the settlement that at that point doesn't meet our criteria, and there would be other infill developments within that settlement boundary. But to reassure members, I'd say that is always going to be a risk, because there's a changing circumstances in other locations where shops and pubs and things may open or close. So it's a fluid situation. But I can see that because there's an allocation here, there is an added risk that perhaps doesn't apply in other places where there's a risk of that happening.
Okay, so we do have a resolution or a proposal that's made. So I'm going to come to Councillor Howard, then Councillor Young, and then we'll go to a vote.
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with you, Chair. Not on principle. In principle, I agree with you. The issue I'm having is consistency. If we are being criticised day after day for not being consistent, we take Tipton as it should be taken. It is a sustainable community. It has a built-up area boundary. It should be taking an allocation. We have taken an allocation and used it for schooling, quite rightly, because there is a need for a school. But if it wasn't allocated for a school, it would still be a sustainable allocation and should be used for housing. And I am struggling in my head with that two, sides of the same argument sort of thing, of trying to be consistent, trying to be even-handed with everybody, and going, by all today, Tipton is sustainable. What might happen in the future is somewhat out of our control to a certain extent. We can try and shape it and everything else. So I'm, as yet, undecided, unfortunately.
So I think your point there, Councillor Howe, is if the school remained in Tipton and wasn't built on Ottery 04, your position would be that should be a housing allocation, and therefore it should be inside the boundary. Yeah. Okay, I understand. Councillor Young.
We all know Tipton is looking for a new site. The other one is in flood zone 3, and it's going to be washed away one day. So any way of getting a new school there, we shouldn't be putting any obstacle in the way. And to me, having 04 allocated for a school is providing something to hang a hat on for a new school there. Therefore, I think it should be included.
Councillor Fernley. And
Thank you. I'm just looking at the map on Google Earth of this break of Ottery 04, and I totally understand where Jess is coming from. It is a massive break. It's not like where we added the 3 houses in Exmouth. And then above, I can't remember the name of that close, you've got further buildings which look like a farm, but if you just look like a pan, you'd stick them all in. And that was just ridiculous because it isn't part of Tipton. So I have to say I'm with the Chair and with Jess on this, that we shouldn't include it.
We're going to end up going round in circles on this one. So I'm going to go to Councillor Jess Bailey as she's not spoken on my proposal, and we're going to follow the letter of the Constitution.
Yeah, I totally support your proposal. Thank you, Chair. If you leave it as it is, Tipton will lose that site and it will go to housing, because that's what you're effectively doing. You're saying, oh, it's in the settlement boundary, therefore there's a presumption, or whatever, however we word it. So we'll just lose the school. So I understand about being consistent, but there's actually no other villages that are like this one. There's no other villages in the same situation. And that site, we've already agreed as a committee that actually it's going to be a school or nothing. So to then include it in the boundary, we can't include it in the boundary because with our other policies, there's an implicit assumption that it's suitable for housing development, and that's not what this committee wants or has agreed before. Thank you.
So I'm going to come to Mr. Freeman, who's finally made his mind up what he thinks, and then we're going to go to a vote.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I think we tried to cover this off, because if you look at the wording of the policy to allocate Ottery 04, we have said, should a school not be built in Tipton St John, the village would not meet the thresholds for Tier 4 settlement and new houses would not be permitted at this site. The problem I'm now realising is, obviously, if we put the site within the settlement boundary and the school isn't built, then we've got a contradiction. And we could try and argue against the development and refuse a development for housing on that site on the basis of the wording of the allocation for Ottery 04. But there is a risk, a significant risk, that a sort of peer and inspector would come along and say, but it's within the settlement boundary, how can you do that? So I think, thinking it all through, I think pragmatically the best way forward would be to redraw the boundary around the southern boundary of Ottery 04, leaving the wording, well, we'll come on to the wording of the policy, but in terms of the boundary, I think that actually makes the most sense. We will have to accept that that is departing from our criteria and is inconsistent, but it is a unique circumstance, so I think we can justify that if challenged.
Okay, that's your advice from Mr. Freeman. Is there anybody who has not spoken who wishes to speak? Councillor Parr.
I'm extremely sad, and it seems wrong to me that when Colleton wanted a site reserved for a school, it was then allocated.
Okay, just testing. Any other members who've not spoken on this proposal? No, okay, then we're going to go to a vote. The proposal is to remove Ottery 04 and Odd Close from the settlement boundary and to otherwise accept the boundary for Tipton St John. All those in favour, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those against? 2, and those abstaining? 2. Okay, that is carried then. Shall we do No, let's take a break now, as we've been going an hour and 50 minutes, and I imagine there's still several more to come to. So we'll take a break until 12 o'clock and then come back.
Good plan.
Okay, welcome back, members. We'll pick up where we left off with Councillor Jess Bailey.
Thank you. Are we talking about West Hill?
Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to say thank you to the officers for actually doing a really good job, by and large, of sorting out. For doing a really good, largely a good job of tidying up, sorting out the boundary, because it's I think it's much better in planning terms. My only, I'm not too keen on the nibbles around the east, and it's actually really quite difficult because of the plan to see, and I've tried to see, even though I know West Hill obviously really well, it's really quite difficult to identify exactly what's being included, but presumably when it goes to Reg 19 it will all be interactive, so we can have a really careful look there. So I won't talk too much, apart from for one particular point, which is if you see the boundary is expanding on the west, isn't it, where there are two site allocations, but actually I'm concerned about the woodland, and it's not shown as woodland here, but it is woodland. There's a section that runs along the north-south B3180, which is shown in orange. It looks like it's just a field, but it's woodland. And I don't think that should be included. I think West Hill's expanded. You can see the Hayes End development directly south of one of the yellow shadings, and that's okay to be included, but I don't think it should go as far up, as far west, because that's actually woodland, and I think that should be excluded. I don't know whether Matt's quite clear on which bit I'm talking, or anybody's quite clear which bit. Yeah, it's the western bit of that bit there.
I think that's a sensible point. So are there any other comments on the West Hill boundary?
Chairman, it goes against what we've been saying on other settlements. I just don't get it. It's not logical to me at all.
How do you think it goes against what we've been saying on other settlements?
Well, the exclusions that we have here, are we pretending that's open countryside? What are we saying?
Okay, so is it worth somebody taking us through why those areas have been excluded at stage 2 on the north and south edges of the settlement? If somebody can speak to that, please.
Excuse me. I think fundamentally the big concern with West Hill is that a lot of these areas on the periphery become very low density and quite sort of separate, in the sense that there's no footpaths, there's no ways of accessing the centre of the village and services and facilities there, so in terms of sustainability for further development and access to the settlement, it's just not. West Hill's a difficult one with all due respect, because it's quite a large land area. It's quite sprawling, but it is quite low density on those edges, and doesn't have those access. Whereas if you look at it, I think if in some of the smaller settlements, those areas that are on the periphery would be so much closer to the core of the village to access services and facilities and be sustainable, but they end up so remote in West Hill because it's quite sprawling that it just becomes unsustainable beyond the boundaries as to what was shown, and I think that's the core of it. But it has been a challenging one to draw the boundary for, as is probably shown by all of the different lines on the plan and how much it's changed. But it's through, I think, listening to the views of the parish council and the ward member, And looking at these areas on the ground, you just feel quite remote from the heart of the village and the services and facilities there.
Councillor Hayward, then Councillor Young.
Thank you, Chair. I can partially understand the northern element because, as you say, the density that it seems more spread out. But I too am struggling to understand why that southern parcel isn't included. You know, perhaps that the foot at the bottom, the very southern edge, but that main block of dwellings there. You know, on the previous allocation, Upline 31, the entire built-up area boundary includes that northern road going up towards Hunter's Lodge. There's no footpath. That simply is houses, a lot of very single detached houses, no footpaths, no lighting, and yet that's included within a settlement boundary. So I can't understand why. I mean, there might be some tweaks to that very southern element, and again, that northern parcel, they're coming to that point where they are pepper potted about, but the bulk of that housing to the south, from the Black Line down to, you know, very near the bottom, I just can't understand why it has been excluded. I appreciate West Hill has some challenges, but it's no more challenging than most of our rural settlements. And I personally think that should be included within the settlement boundary. Thank you.
Can I respond?
I'm going to go around people who haven't already spoken first, and then we'll see where we get to. Councillor Young.
Yeah, I can see the point, but you've got the settlement boundary where development would be suitable, and then you've got the areas which are going to be in the open countryside. But by looking at it on the map here, it looks quite built up. So people are going to be confused. Well, no, why can't I build a new house in my back garden? And you say, well, it's in the open countryside. But I've got houses all around me. I'm not in the open countryside. So it's almost a case of we need an in-between designation. So it's now I pass these houses almost every day, and now I have to slow down because it's 30 speed limit because it's built up area, but I'm told it's not by this map, so it's a bit confusing. But I can see the reasons why, and I think I would support it. But we need to be very, very clear on why we've done this, because it's almost against it's against logic to me. But I also can see the logic from the planning standpoint, because we haven't got a designation that is semi-rural.
Councillor Howe.
Yeah, this is one of those awkward ones, by sure, but it's not unique, and that's why we've got to be careful. If you look at Otterton, Newton Poppleford, half a dozen other places, we're doing the same thing. So it's about consistency. I mean, I'm not particularly happy with it because the understanding, as Councillor Young has just said, it screams the wrong sort of understanding, but at the same time I can understand what officers are trying to do and why they're trying to do it. So I think I'm going to have to go with officers on this one for reasonable reasons, shall we say, but I am struggling with it at the same time.
Reasonable reasons implies the existence of unreasonable reasons, Councillor Howe.
Half of what we do is unreasonable, but that's a different matter altogether.
Okay. Any other members who haven't spoken yet? Councillor Parr.
What is the difference in density of development of the area hatched outlined in green and that within the development boundary?
Off the top of my head, I don't know. I don't think we've calculated the exact densities. I mean, I can see obviously on the map it is fairly dense. I think it is visibly lower density than the areas that are within the settlement boundary, but still clearly built up and relatively dense. I think the issue here and the distinction I would make is the distance and some of the gradients between that southern part of the area and the sort of centre of the village. Most of our other villages where you've got roads where there's no footpaths, there's no street lighting, and people are having to walk on the carriageway to their local pub or shop or whatever. It's relatively short distances because the settlements are more compact, whereas the sprawling nature of West Hill means that in that southern area, those distances are quite long distances along roads that are quite well trafficked as well, which makes that more challenging with the gradients added in as well. I think it's difficult to say that development in that southern area in particular is sustainable, which is why we're proposing redrawing the boundary as we have. And I think that's what makes it distinct from most of the settlements. I take Councillor Howe's point that we have not the similar issue perhaps with Newton Poppleford in particular, I would suggest, when we come to that in terms of the western part of the village there, where it comes down again to accessibility to services and facilities. It's not that it's not built up, and clearly there's development there, but how accessible are the services and facilities for people living in that part of the village? And that's the principle here in West Hill as well.
Okay, I see no other hands to come to for the first time, so I'm going to come to Jess.
Thank you. I just need to clarify that actually the dark line, which is the proposed boundary, is virtually the same as it was within the village's plan. So we're, unlike virtually every other settlement in all of East Devon, the officers at the first stage consultation radically redrew that to include all these other areas that hadn't been in the village's plan before, for the very reason that they're not sustainable. So they're actually, it's quite misleading by just looking at a map, but they are miles away and it's extremely hilly, and there've been multiple appeal decisions in both the north section and the south section that say it's not sustainable because how difficult it is to get from those southern sections or from the northern sections into the centre of the village. So it probably takes, I would think, about 40-minute walk from, and that's somebody who's quite able-bodied from those sections, and they are not sustainable. It's really far, they're really remote, it's really steep, there's no lights, and you know, that we're not, West Hill isn't asking for anything. West Hill was treated really differently from virtually every other settlement during this consultation process, when inexplicably these areas were suddenly added in, these vast areas. So there won't be any confusion from residents or the parish council if we go back to virtually what we had before, which was as shown in the villages plan. And that is what is sustainable. The fact that in the 60s and 70s houses were built miles away, they just shouldn't be built there now because it's not a sustainable location, and it just generates a whole load of car use. And there's already a lot of car use in West Hill because of the difficult walking conditions. So I think you should be consistent. You should not single out West Hill and treat it differently and give it a huge boundary, which it didn't have before. So I hope that you will use the proposed boundary that the officers are proposing, which they are correctly doing now, and with the exception of the woodland adjacent to the B3180. Thank you.
Councillor Ingham.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank Councillor Hayward for pointing out Upline, which he did very gently. I'll have a look at Upline again and look at land included in accordance with criteria B1. Look at all those areas being included within that settlement boundary that were not there before, and look at the density of housing or lack of it in there. And this comes down to consistency again. Is Upline flat? Don't think so. I don't think so. You need to go there again, I think. And I just think this is being inconsistent, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Ingham. Your microphone, please. Thank you. Do any other members wish to speak on this? No? Okay. Councillor Jess Bailey, did you want to make a proposal?
Yeah, I propose that we support the officer's recommendation showing the black line, which is as per the village's line, with the exception of the small section on the west adjacent to the B3180. And we don't single out West Hill and treat it differently from our other communities.
Is that Councillor Young?
Yeah, I second that.
Okay, that's a proposal that's been validly made and seconded then to adopt the boundaries proposed by officers with the exception of that small section on the west side. Are there any further comments? Okay, in which case we will take that to a vote. All those in favour, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, those against? 3, and those abstaining. Okay, that is carried then. What's next? Clyst St Mary.
Well, I thought you were going to want to do yours.
Nah, we'll do. I'm feeling generous. We'll do Clyst St Mary, Mike.
Okay. And thank you, Chair. And really, it's just for clarity because Clyst St Mary is being treated differently from everyone else, and I wholeheartedly support that for the reasons given in the report. But there are some queries, and funny enough, after we just discussed about West Hill, I am now struggling to understand how we are including the whole of Winslade Manor, which is not housing, it's industrial, office work, but it is a long distance from the facilities with no easy paths or anything else. And it's a strange one. But at the same time, I support it, and I just want to clarify that we are relying on the neighbourhood plan to make the allocations and the built-up area boundary for those new allocations in this report. Thank you.
Yes, so because we haven't agreed any allocations in Clyst St Mary, it's being left to the neighbourhood plan. You'll see that there are no allocations on the plan, and the built-up area boundary is not being drawn around the potential allocations that are coming forward in the neighbourhood plan. We're leaving that for the neighbourhood plan as well. I don't think there would be much logic in drawing the built-up area boundary around hypothetical allocations that are coming forward in the neighbourhood plan. The neighbourhood plan can draw its own boundary, so I assume it will at that time to include those areas as necessary. In terms of Winslade Park, I think I hear the point that there will be residential there. There's consent for just over 100, I think, dwellings within the Winslade Park development, and obviously you have the combination of those homes and jobs right next to each other, some leisure facilities within the site, sports facilities right by it. So yes, there are other facilities within the settlement that are a further distance away, but I think it's still a reasonable walking distance, within a 20-minute walking distance anyway. So I think it's following the criteria by including that area at Winslade Park, to my mind.
In that case, I'm happy to move it. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Howe. I will second that. Do any other members wish to comment on this one? No? Okay, in which case then, all in favour of this boundary as drawn? Everyone with the exception of Councillor Parr. Any against? Any abstentions? That's 1. Okay. If committee will indulge me then, unless anybody else wants to talk about a settlement. No, it's the next agenda item, Brian, if you want to talk about the site allocation policies. Councillor Hayward?
Thank you, Chair. Well, unsurprisingly, I'm going to ask that committee considers upline, because we've just established a precedent now, and essentially everything above the exception site on the western side, so that's the road going up to Hunter's Lodge, and I would argue everything on that eastern peninsula. I've walked up Lyme many a time for reasons connected with elections. It will take you an entire day to walk to every one of those properties. The distances and the gradients and the access and the lack of pavements, you walk on the roads. And whilst there is that core conurbation, that settlement in the middle that butts up against Dorset and goes down to the Black Dog, as soon as you are at that new school close, the exception site shown on the north western side, I just think that that's not, using the precedent we've just established, that's not a settlement boundary. I would just curtail it at a relevant point alongside that exception site, and certainly not include everything to the northeast, because it's by that very principle.
Do you mean northwest, Councillor Hayward?
Northwest and northeast. Both of those northern sections are very low density, very difficult to access, high gradients. So, so effectively, I wish I had my laser pointer, I could point it up here for you, but essentially everything where it says exception site halfway down, so draw a line across there, so everything north of that is very inaccessible. Take your life in your hands walking up there, and the houses are Raymond's Hill level of dwellings per hectare. And then if you go to that section there, effectively everything there is remote. You know, there's a house every 100 yards, huge amounts of area, but we've just determined that actually it's remote, it's difficult to walk to the centre. I mean, for what there is in the centre of Uplyme anyway, that, you know, essentially you've got a village hall, a cricket pitch and a shop. The shop opens when it wants to. And then you've got a pub down by Black Dog. So, you know, I would argue that they deserve equal treatment if we're going to be consistent. And, you know, as Councillor Ingham alluded to earlier, we've said here, land is included in accordance with criteria B1. Well, we've just decided that doesn't apply anymore. So I propose that we draw a line in those relevant points and exclude those areas. And that's no longer part of the built-up area boundary. The core of Uplyme is, but not those peripheral bits to the north. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, I heard the word proposal, so I'm going to have to look for a seconder. Councillor Ingham, do you wish to speak briefly? No? Okay. So we have a proposal that's been seconded then. Mr. Freeman's giving me a funny look.
Well, Chair, I'm wondering what is the proposal? What would be the changes to the boundary? I think it might be useful if I respond, but I was going to check something first. But my perception is that in terms of the differences between Uplyme and West Hill, I don't think the distances from those extremities of the boundary that we're proposing are anywhere near as significant as the distances from the southernmost point of West Hill that we were talking about a minute ago. If you give me a minute, I can go in and measure them. But I'm pretty sure those distances are substantially lower, which is why we've included those areas with the boundary, accepting your points about you know, there not being footpaths, it not being lit, but that applies to most of our villages fundamentally that don't have separate footpaths and street lighting and things. So I don't think that would be a reason for excluding those areas. So I think, to my mind, that's what distinguishes Uplyme from West Hill, is the distances involved. If you can give me a minute, I can do some measurements.
No, I shan't give you a minute, Mr. Freeman. What a ridiculous suggestion. Okay, so who hasn't spoken yet? Councillor Howe hasn't, Councillor Young hasn't.
You know, I was going to raise the point that Mr. Freeman's obviously going to double check the distances. I don't believe the distance are as good, but I fully accept what Councillor Hayward's saying. But the one thing, obviously, we've already made the rule, so I imagine the line will be drawn around the exception site, whichever choice we make going forward, because it has to be.
Good point. Councillor Young.
Yeah, you've got that exception site there that it's excluded at the moment, but I presume it's built. So why isn't that in it? And it is following the village's plan, which went out for consultation some years ago and was approved and supported, etc. So I don't really see why we should now cut it down. It's not logical to now reduce it compared with what it was and agreed some years ago. But I do see the point where they, from the flood area has now been included, whereas it wasn't before.
So, pursuant to the resolution earlier, the exception sites will go in now when we get to the regulation 19 version. Is there anybody else who wants to speak for the first time? Councillor Parr.
Well, on this matter of exception sites, I know on the Collerton plan, which I'm not talking about the site I have a financial involvement with, but the exception sites are clearly labelled as excluded because they are exception sites, which I think is right.
Councillor Hayward.
Thank you, Chair. Just again, this is the whole point of what we're doing. We're debating and discussing. From personal experience, and I'm going to refer now to Newton Poppleford. We haven't covered Newton Poppleford. As the former clerk of that parish, I can tell you it's quicker to walk from the centre of Newton Poppleford than it is to Borough or Down Close, which are now being excluded, than it is to walk from Upline Village Hall to either of those places. Because I have walked it. The gradients are higher, the distances are further, they're unlit, unpaved roads. You walk on verges. So if we are going to keep these in, and mindful of what we've just discussed in West Hill, then we need to revert straight to Newton Poppleford and consider why we are removing Borough and Down Close, because they can be accessed on footpaths, they can be accessed quite easily, and they are urban, semi-urban, built up settlement areas within a service village. We are creating, by doing this, the tools to hit us over the head with in future. It's not consistent. It's not logical to remove one and then to keep another one in and then to have another one where it's removed, when the evidence on the ground of just walking that distance isn't there. It just doesn't make any sense, and we will be challenged on it. Thank you.
Through you, Chair, I've done some quick measuring as the crow flies. So by my measurement, from the centre of Upline to the extremities, both sort of northeast and northwest, is about 680 metres. At West Hill, the distance from the centre of the village to the southern extremity of what we were talking about, as you could potentially extend it out to, is over 1,100 metres. So it's to the extremity of where we've shown the built-up area boundary is a similar distance to the extremity of the Upline built-up area settlement boundary as shown on the screen. So we've tried to be consistent in terms of the distances because we're trying to keep things within this sort of 20-minute walking distance. So I think it is consistent. I think those distances are substantially lower at Upline than at West Hill, which is why we had the concern about that southern part of West Hill, because it is a lot further. It's probably slightly deceptive on the maps and the papers because I think the different scales used, we tried to make it so that the settlements are as big as possible on the page.
Okay, so we do have a resolution that's been made and seconded. Councillor Hayward, could you perhaps clarify by reference to the map where you're proposing to eliminate from the Upline settlement boundary? Perhaps without... Do you want to come and use Mr. Dickens's mouse to show it? Is that... Oh, no. Oh, at least this isn't on YouTube. There. Okay, so at the... Okay, so those two pinch points. Oh, yeah, for the benefit of the record, Mr. Dickens, do you want to highlight on the screen where that's... No, that wasn't it. It was the other side of the exception site. Yeah, that pinch point there, yeah. And then across there, yeah. So that's Councillor Hayward's proposal, seconded by Councillor Ingham.
So just to be clear, what you've got on the screen is you can see a sort of orange line, which is the old villages plan boundary. So that's the current boundary. So that's cutting it back substantially from the current boundary as well, not just from what's proposed, just so members are clear.
Okay, so we have a proposal. Are there any other comments on that proposal before I take it to a vote and we see what happens? Okay, those in favour of cutting back the boundary according to Councillor Hayward's proposal, please. 4, because Colin can't raise his hand higher. I see 4. Those against, please. 6. And those abstaining? That's none. Okay, so that fails. I will propose then from the chair that we adopt the boundary as recommended by officers. All those in favour, please.
Yeah, we've got that.
The exception site will go in subject to the resolution earlier. All those in favour of adopting the boundary as set out by officers, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've lost a vote. Those against? 1, 2, 3, 4. And those abstaining? 1. That's where that vote went. Okay, so that is carried then. Other boundaries, members, bearing in mind that time marches on. Safe travels, Councillor Young. Okay, I see no further hands, so with committee's forbearance, I'd like to bring us to Wimpole, which I just need to find. Everyone else has done it, so I'm doing it as well. Wimpole. Here we go. And there's, yes, page 91, almost right at the end. There's just one area I want to talk about. I'm happy with the proposal to extend it to the northeast, given the inclusion of Wimpole 11. I think that meets the criteria. I disagree, however, on the northwestern edge, where it's proposed to extend it out to the edge past the green there, up to where it says Willowbrook House. The map saying that's included in accordance with criteria B1. Criteria B1 is built and extant planning permissions for residential and employment uses, which are both physically and functionally related to the settlement. I'd contend, I think in the strongest possible terms, that actually physically and functionally the edge of Wimpole is where the orange line is. As soon as you get past that point, you are not in the core village of Wimpole anymore. We've excluded other areas in other settlements on the grounds that they're not in the core village. And I'm going to move from the chair, because I can, that we exclude that northwestern parcel beyond the orange line on that basis. And I'll see whether committee agree with me or not, but I'm done speaking now. Anybody else wish to comment? Councillor Jess Bailey.
Yeah, that seems logical to me.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Freeman, did you have anything to say? Tell me I'm wrong.
Well, just for the committee's benefit, I think the logic is, I think that area sort of to the north of the road, as I understand it, is a sort of mugger and an area of open space linked to the Bovis development to the east of that. But I think that's our logic, was that it's part of that development. As to how that's secured, I don't know without checking. And I think the site to the south of the road, I think we did look at that as a potential allocation at one stage, and members were quite comfortable with potentially allocating that apart from the area within the flood zone. And then it was concluded that because we hadn't done the additional flood risk assessment work that was needed because of the drainage issues there, that it would be included within the settlement boundary. So it's partly reflecting that discussion that was had at the allocation stage when the committee were discussing Wimpole. I'll perhaps hand back to Chair if he's got greater knowledge of that northern area, but it does look from aerial photographs like it's some kind of public open space with footpaths and access into it.
It's definitely not a public open space. It is used by the school on occasion, as it's immediately next door to the Mugger. The Forest School goes up there every so often, but it's definitely not public open space. The other thing I'd say about the allocation point is I think Councillor Ingham quite liked that site, and committee wanted to allocate something in Wimple. I don't remember any particular support for this site specifically. But that's my recollection. I could be wrong. I don't want to have an argument with my best friend Ed. So, members, any further comments here? Councillor Ingham?
Thank you, Chair. No, I think that the recommendation is correct from the officers.
Just for the benefit of the tape, the recommendation from officers, Councillor Ingham has clarified. Councillor Howe, did you have something to say?
Yeah, go on. I must admit I'm torn on this one, because accepting the chair's view, it does feel different when you go out into this area. You're going out into the countryside. There is a distinct difference as soon as you get past the roundabout that's there. You are in open countryside. You don't see any built-up area around you. So I am struggling with the change, shall we say, because it really does on the ground feel very different and look different. But then when you look at it on the map, you're sort of comparing to other seats. It's easily accessible to the village centre and everything else, and it's, I don't know, I'm struggling both ways, shall we say. I can go either way on that one.
It's probably a fair comment. Nowhere in Wimple's particularly far from the village centre. It is a bit of a trek up Grove Road and Church Road, but nowhere's a huge distance. Any other comments on this one? No? Okay, in which the proposal then is to accept officers' recommendations, save that area outside the existing village's plan boundary on the northwest side. All those in favour, please. Resounding support. 3. Those against? 2, and those abstaining, everyone else. So that is carried with possibly the smallest vote in favour of anything that we've seen for a while. Okay. Any other comments on any of the other boundaries? Councillor Hayward, are we coming to Axminster?
No. I mean, actually, I'm thank you to officers for the work they've done on Axminster. Obviously, Axminster through this committee has been laboured upon, but I'm grateful for the boundaries that have been proposed, because they are sensible and they cover the points we've already gone over in this meeting about excluding areas that must not be used for building, which must be open space, etc. So the die is cast for Axminster, and this committee has made its voice known on that. Proof of the pudding will be in the eating. But I come back to Newton Poppleford, because we come back to this logic as so if the map could be called up for Newton Poppleford, again, I just come back to a matter of precedent, principle and consistency. If we call that up there, so you have at the very bottom of the page, the settlement boundary goes right to the bottom of Newt 4 and 5. So the distance from the Cannon Inn, let's say, in Newton Poppleford High Street to the very bottom, that westward kicking boot of the very bottom of Newt 4, it's further to there than it is to Parsons Close, Down Close, everywhere. Doesn't make any. It makes no logic for that southern element. Again, well, I'm going to buy a laser pointer next time. But everything to the west of that beige-coloured section should be included, because it's closer to get to the village than it is to get to the bottom of Newt 4. It's inconsistent. Borough, the top of Borough, I'll give you that. I walk quite fast, I can get there. But actually, that inverted L-shaped section there, certainly the bit off the Exmouth Road, it should be included just for consistency, because yes, Newton Poppleford is a linear village. Honiton is a linear village. We've just seen, you've just added within the Honiton, I think, all the stuff right to the end of Gittisham. That's further than those areas there are. So I just want us to be consistent. And I can't see how that can be where you draw the boundary around Newt 4, but you don't include houses on the immediate other side of the road, or those north of it, which just by looking at that map will be closer to the centre of the village than the bottom of that boot. I just can't understand it.
Mr. Freeman, could you clarify officers' thinking here, please?
Yes, so I would start by saying that we had quite a few discussions among the team about exactly that issue. So I would start by saying I don't think we're precious about this and can see both sides of this. I think part of the challenge has always been in terms of that sort of western area by the Exmouth Road at Newton Poppleford is not so much the distance to the centre of the village, but how you access the centre of the village in terms of footpath linkages and the pinch point by the old toll house at the mini roundabout. And obviously members agreed to allocate Newto 4 and Newto 5 on the basis of this link through at the northern end of of Newto 5 into the footpath that runs behind the High Street and through to King Alfred Way as a safe way of creating that link. And the logic was that until that link is established, there were still difficulties in terms of that part of the village around Exmouth Road in terms of actually physically safely accessing those services and facilities at the centre of the village, and that perhaps once Newto 5 is built out and that link is there, then you could potentially bring in that area around Exmouth Road. But in the meantime, it was challenging in terms of safety of access really from that part of the village. And that's partly based on a couple of appeal decisions we've had now, one very recently, in fact, in that area for a permission in principle application, which was refused on appeal on the basis of the poor linkages through in terms of safety and footpath links through to the centre of the village from that area. So the only thing that's changing is through this plan, through the allocation of Newto 5 to create that much better link into the footpath that exists. And our feeling was until that's changed, we would be running contrary to that appeal decision and previous appeal decisions in that area. So that's why we haven't included it. I can equally see a case for saying you could argue that through the plan we're addressing those issues and that area could come forward as part of the strategy for delivering that. But we don't know when Newto 5 might be built out. It might never be built out. So it's another one of those balancing exercises. I think we were ultimately perhaps about 55% to leaving that area out versus. So it was quite finely balanced. So interested to hear committee's views on that, but that was our thinking.
So it was Scottish independence referendum rather than Brexit in the percentages. Yes. There we go. Obscure politics joke of the day. Okay, coming to Councillor Jess Bailey.
Thank you. So I'm the county councillor, just as a declaration for Newton Poppleford. I would support the constrained boundaries for the reasons that Ed Freeman has expressed. I'm concerned about putting pressure, pedestrian access to the centre of the village, and the appeal decision, which I think was down at the bottom of Newt, on the bottom of the west side of the Exmouth Road. And the accessibility issues with the facilities at the centre of the village, and particularly road safety concerns. So I would be supporting the more constrained boundary that officers are recommending. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Bailey. Other comments on this one? Councillor Ingham? Oh, not on this one, okay. I'm going to take the opportunity to speak then, and I have to say in this particular instance, I think I agree more with Paul than I do with Jess. But I'm not going to make a proposal because I don't want to. Councillor Jess Bailey?
I'll make a proposal that we support the officer's recommendation for the more constrained boundaries as shown in the is it the stage 2 settlement boundaries with a thick black line? Thank you.
That's the proposal to adopt officer's recommendation then. Does anybody wish to second it? It would appear not. Sorry, Jess. In which case then, for the sake of expediency, I will propose that we adopt officer's recommendation. No, that's just not been. I mean that we adopt the larger area that's shown at stage 1 rather than the stage 2 area as the settlement boundary.
For the whole of it.
Yes. If that's the logical area for me to propose. But that's what the 45% was leaning towards, putting that whole area inside the settlement boundary. Have I understood that correctly?
Well, I mean, I think, without wishing to complicate things even further, there is a third option whereby you just include the areas off the Exmouth Road rather than Borough, because the footpath along the A3052 ends not far west of the mini roundabout, if I recall. So actually pedestrian access from this area is more limited than it, in some respects, than it is from here. It's the pinch point.
Okay, in that case, I will propose from the chair that the settlement boundary is the area shown at stage 2, plus the area adjacent to Exeter Road, with the exact boundary to be drawn by officers and agreed by Mr. Freeman in consultation with the chair. So I'm proposing that the area in black is edged in black is included within the settlement boundary, and then also the areas adjacent to Exeter Road, which is the orange road that you see coming down from that horrible junction there. Sorry? Sorry, Exmouth Road, yes. I think everybody knew what I was talking about when I said the orange one. So with that area adjacent to the orange road to be included, but the exact boundary to be drawn by officers and come back on the 11th, because I don't know it well enough to decide exactly where the line should go. I think that's reasonable.
Do you mean also west of the Exmouth Road, south of the Exeter Road?
Yes. Yes.
But not
Not, yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So come, yeah. So that yeah, the bit sort of west of the orange bit, but not out extending along the red bit, the red road, if that makes sense.
Up to it.
Not. This is doing my head in. That area immediately to the west of the orange road. This is why I didn't want to make a proposal. Thanks very much, guys, for leaving it to me. Okay, is everybody...
No, he's not going to.
You do them out, out there.
Somewhere like there, yeah. Somewhere in that line there.
Yeah, we're happy with that. Something like that.
Somewhere about
So
there.
the stuff that's coming off the orange road is included. The stuff that isn't.
Yeah.
Borough quite often, and I defer entirely to Councillor Bailey in her county council role. Borough, on one hand, likes its independence and its sort of the lack of not being conjoined, but it also moans, or used to, that it always was excluded from Newton Poppleford things by its location. But I think on this, if you excluded Borough, and then, as you say, draw that line almost where the narrowest point is on that green section where you're indicating, that I think is a pragmatic solution. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, that's my proposal, and to give Ed delegated power to draw the exact line. Ed says thank you very much. All those in favour of that proposal, please. Everyone except Jess. Those against? And those abstaining is Jess. Okay, very good. Are there any other settlement boundaries that we specifically want to discuss? Councillor Ringham.
You'll be pleased to hear I approve of the one of Exton, Lympstone and Woodbury, not because they're where I would draw the line, but because they're acceptable. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Ingham. in which case I'm going to propose all of the remaining boundaries as en bloc, that we accept officer's recommendation on all of those, if Mr. Hunter's happy with that. Yep, okay. All those in favour, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those against? And those abstaining? 3. Okay, thank you very much, members. Then we just need to deal with the policy wordings, which are the last items remaining under agenda item 6. So if you go back to the policy, the covering report, paragraphs 1.2 and 1.3 includes the wording of policies SPO5 and SPO6 that we deferred from the last meeting. Do members have any comments on those wordings? No, okay, in which case I will propose from the chair that those go forward to the draft regulation 19 plan as recommended. All those in favour, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those against? 1. And those abstaining? 1. Okay, that is carried then. That brings us to the end of the first item on the agenda for today. My suggestion is that we break for lunch now for 45 minutes and then return at 1:40. That would make it
20 minutes, 1:15.
Okay, do members want a shorter lunch?
Yeah.
Okay. Ed's negotiating for half an hour because he wants to take a walk for his sanity. So we'll take a break until 1:30 and then come back and continue with the rest of the agenda.